Yeah, so this has now been passed by the lower house in the EU's legislature, which is the European Parliament, but it still must also be passed by the upper house of the EU's legislature, which is the EU Council, made up of ministers from national governments. And the Council is almost always more conservative than the Parliament, especially when it comes to climate issues. So it's very unlikely we will actually end up with a 2035 phase-out date. The Council may go for a 2040, and then the two versions of the legislation have to be reconciled, just like with the Senate and the House of Representatives in the U.S. system. And so maybe we end up with a 2037 end date. It's important to point out that this is just an end to the sale of diesel and petrol cars, but the cars themselves can still be driven on the road. Essentially, you could buy a petrol or diesel car right up until 2035, if that is the year we end up with, and then you could continue driving it, let's say, for 15 years. So it means that petrol and diesel cars could still be on the road until 2050. It's also important to point out that this isn't a ban on the combustion engine itself. These are CO2 limits that would be unreachable by petrol or diesel cars. So basically, the limit on the CO2 that the cars and the fleet average can emit would be going steadily down until 2035. And finally, in 2035, it would reach a level that no fossil fuel powered car could reach. And that would mean electric or some future technology that we don't know yet for cars. It's a timeline, it's phased in, and that means that even those petrol and diesel cars that are sold, let's say, right before this final deadline, would be extremely fuel efficient because that CO2 limit will have gone down over the previous years.
Okay, so that sounds like one step forward. But there was a step backwards, wasn't there, with regards to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which was rejected by the EU Parliament. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, this was a really shocking development today because it was actually rejected by Green and Left MEPs. And that's because conservative members of the parliament had, in the course of this afternoon, added amendments that greatly weakened this legislation. Now, this is the creation of a levy on goods imported into the EU if they're coming from countries with less stringent climate legislation than the EU. So they therefore have a higher carbon footprint. What the Greens and the left were objecting to is this is essentially a way to protect European businesses from global competition because obviously the EU businesses are facing more stringent climate legislation than businesses in countries like India or China. So the idea is you level the playing field by adding this cost to the imports of goods, and you prevent carbon leakage. You prevent companies from moving outside of Europe to avoid the legislation. But they already have this type of protection in the existing EU emissions trading system where they get free allowances. And what the Conservatives added today was extending those free allowances for many, many years at the same time that the carbon border tax would be applying. So basically, the European businesses would be getting double compensation. The left and the Greens said, we don't like what happened during the course of this voting in the afternoon. We are rejecting the entire package. So this is now being sent back to committee, and we'll see what happens there. I think they're gearing up for a really, really big fight between the MEPs on the left and the MEPs on the right in how much European industry needs to be protected as the EU enacts way more stringent climate legislation than the rest of the world, and particularly of the developing countries like India and China.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that update, Dave Keating in Brussels. Thank you very much indeed.